America's story is vast, complex, and deeply influential. But before it became a world power, it was a land of many nations, shaped by indigenous civilizations, colonial ambition, and revolutionary ideals. In this documentary, we trace the early roots of the United States, from its earliest inhabitants to its fight for independence. Long before the idea of the United States existed, this land was home to millions of Native Americans. For over 10,000 years, indigenous peoples developed rich and diverse cultures, from the Inuit in the Arctic to the Seminole in the South. Some built complex cities like the Mississippian culture's Cahokia, a metropolis larger than London in its time. Others, like the Iroquois, formed sophisticated political systems, some of which would influence the future U.S. Constitution. These civilizations thrived independently until the arrival of Europeans drastically altered their world. From the late 1400s, European explorers, driven by trade, religion, and empire, set sail for the New World. Spain claimed large swathes of the South and West. France focused on the interior and fur trade. The Dutch established New Amsterdam, later New York. But it was England's 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast that would most profoundly shape the future United States. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement. Life was harsh, but tobacco cultivation brought wealth. In 1620, the Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony, seeking religious freedom. The Mayflower Compact laid early foundations for self-government. Over the next century, colonies grew in number, population, and diversity. Welsh, Scots-Irish, Germans, Africans, all adding to the cultural mix. However, colonization came at a devastating cost to native populations, through disease, displacement, and war. By the mid-1700s, 13 colonies were thriving, but British control over colonial trade, land, and taxation began to cause growing resentment. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain imposed new taxes on the colonies, like the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, without giving them representation in Parliament. The cry of no taxation without representation took hold. Tensions boiled over with the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers killed 5 civilians. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party, a protest against British monopoly, shocked the empire. Britain cracked down with the Intolerable Acts, prompting the colonies to unite. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met to organize resistance. The stage was set for revolution. The Revolutionary War began in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord. Militia known as the Minutemen clashed with British regulars in what became known as the Shot Heard Round the World. Led by General George Washington, the Continental Army fought against one of the world's strongest militaries. It was a war of endurance, fought in harsh winters with uncertain resources. On July 4, 1776, the colonies formally declared independence. The Declaration, penned by Thomas Jefferson, stated revolutionary ideals, natural rights, and the consent of the governed. Key victories at Saratoga and Yorktown, along with French military and financial support, led to American triumph. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the war and recognized U.S. independence. Victory brought freedom, but also the challenge of building a functional government. The Articles of Confederation gave little power to the federal government, leading to economic turmoil and internal unrest, like Shays' Rebellion. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention was convened in Philadelphia. Delegates debated fiercely but produced a groundbreaking document, the U.S. Constitution. It created a system of checks and balances, federalism, and separation of powers. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president. 2 years later, the Bill of Rights was ratified, guaranteeing freedoms that would become core to the American identity. By 1790, the United States was independent, constitutional, and growing, but also divided. In the early 1800s, the United States was still a coastal republic, but ambition knew no bounds. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson struck a monumental deal, the Louisiana Purchase. For just $15 million, the U.S. acquired over 800,000 square miles of territory from France, doubling its size overnight. Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on a journey to chart this vast, unknown region. Their expedition brought back maps, scientific discoveries, and contacts with indigenous nations, many of whom would later face tragic consequences. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely destined to settle the entire continent, swept the nation. Settlers moved westward in droves, encouraged by the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered land to families willing to farm it. But this expansion came at a steep cost. Native nations were forcibly removed from ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to events like the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee died during forced marches west. As the country expanded, so did a central question. Would new states allow slavery? The South's economy depended on enslaved labor, particularly in cotton production. The North, increasingly industrial and abolitionist, opposed its expansion. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise tried to keep peace, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. But every new territory brought the issue back. The Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act attempted to appease both sides, but they only deepened divisions. Meanwhile, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison exposed the horrors of slavery. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin electrified the nation, painting a vivid picture of the human suffering caused by slavery. In 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision ruled that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. The South celebrated while the North was outraged. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president with a platform that opposed the spread of slavery. Southern states, beginning with South Carolina, viewed this as a direct threat to their way of life and began to secede from the Union. By early 1861, the Confederate States of America was formed. In April 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. It would become the most devastating conflict in American history. Over the next 4 years, North and South clashed in brutal battles: Manassas, Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg. Cities were burned, economies collapsed, and over 600,000 soldiers lost their lives. Yet amidst the horror came a turning point. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in Confederate states. The war was now also a fight for human liberation. The Union's industrial strength and manpower slowly wore down the Confederacy. In April 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over, but the wounds would take generations to heal. President Lincoln would not live to rebuild the nation. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, he was assassinated. The task of Reconstruction fell to others. Reconstruction aimed to reintegrate Southern states and ensure rights for newly freed African Americans. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed citizenship. The 15th granted voting rights. But backlash came quickly. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in violence. Black codes and Jim Crow laws restricted freedoms. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn, and Reconstruction effectively ended, leaving racial justice an unfinished promise. The Civil War preserved the Union and ended slavery, but the nation remained deeply scarred. After the Civil War, the United States transformed rapidly. Railroads stretched from coast to coast. Cities swelled with immigrants and workers. The nation entered the Second Industrial Revolution, a time of steel, oil, electricity, and innovation. Industrial giants like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in finance amassed unprecedented fortunes, but their rise came with stark inequality. Poor working conditions, child labor, and tenement slums sparked a wave of reformers. Labor movements emerged, demanding fair wages and safer work. At the same time, immigrants from Europe and Asia poured into cities, seeking opportunity and often facing discrimination and hardship. In 1898, the United States fought Spain in the Spanish-American War. In just months, the U.S. seized control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marking its emergence as an imperial power. America's influence extended beyond its borders, but at home, reformers pushed the progressive era, a movement to fight corruption, expand democracy, and improve lives through government action. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, helping to end the conflict in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations, but the U.S. ultimately chose isolation. In 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging the U.S. into the Great Depression. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and breadlines stretched around city blocks. Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with the New Deal, a sweeping set of government programs designed to rescue the economy and restore hope. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the U.S. into World War II. American industry and military might help turn the tide in Europe and the Pacific. When the war ended in 1945, the United States stood as one of two global superpowers, ushering in a new era, the Cold War. From the late 1940s to the 1990s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union vied for influence across the globe. It was a conflict of ideology, democracy versus communism, played out through arms races, proxy wars, and diplomacy. At home, the United States faced a reckoning with its own values. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s challenged segregation and demanded equal rights. Leaders like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and countless activists pushed America to confront injustice. Laws changed, but the struggle for equality continued. By the late 20th century, the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The U.S. emerged as the world's dominant power. The 21st century began with a new challenge: terrorism. The attacks on September 11, 2001, led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, reshaping U.S. foreign policy for decades. Technology revolutionized daily life. The internet, smartphones, and social media transformed how Americans work, connect, and consume information. The history of the United States is a story of contradiction, of liberty and injustice, of dreams and division, of progress and setbacks. From indigenous lands to global dominance, it has been a journey shaped by struggle, resilience, and reinvention. As America moves into the future, one truth remains clear: its story is still being written by the people who dare to imagine a more perfect union.